In December 1971, the last British warships sailed out of the Persian Gulf, ending a century of imperial dominance over the world's most valuable waterway. Almost overnight, a dangerous power vacuum opened at the doorway to the oil riches of the Middle East, a choke point that one American newspaper described as strategically equal to Panama, Suez, and the Dardanelles combined. The Shah of Iran rushed to fill that vacuum, seizing 3 contested islands near the Strait of Hormuz and declaring himself the guardian of the Gulf's most critical passage. His justification was simple. If those islands fell into hostile hands, it could threaten every barrel of oil flowing out of the Persian Gulf and into the engines of the modern world. When the Islamic Revolution toppled the Shah in 1979, the new theocratic regime inherited not just his country, but also his obsession with controlling the Strait of Hormuz. But where the Shah saw the strait as something to protect, the Ayatollahs saw it as something to weaponize. A loaded gun pointed at the throat of the global economy. The Strait of Hormuz sits between Iran to the north and Oman to the south, a narrow corridor of water barely 21 miles wide at its most slender point. The shipping lane itself is only about 2 miles wide in each direction, meaning the largest supertankers on Earth must navigate through a channel thinner than many American rivers. In 2024, roughly 20 million barrels of oil flowed through this bottleneck every single day, according to the United States Energy Information Administration. That staggering volume represents approximately 1/4 of all seaborne oil traded globally and about 1/5 of total worldwide petroleum consumption. But oil is only half the story. Nearly 20% of the world's liquefied natural gas shipments also transit through the strait, with Qatar supplying the vast majority of those cargoes. 84% of the crude flowing through Hormuz is bound for Asia, with China, India, Japan, and South Korea depending on that corridor like a lifeline they cannot sever. For nearly 50 years, Iranian leaders have wielded this geography like a weapon, threatening to shut down the strait at least 15 times since 1980. During the Iran-Iraq War, during nuclear standoffs in 2008, 2011, 2012, 2018, 2019, and again in 2024, every time Iran felt cornered, the threat was the same. Close the strait, strangle the oil supply, send crude prices past $100 a barrel, and watch the global economy buckle under the pressure of energy starvation. The first real test came during the tanker war of the 1980s, when Iran and Iraq turned the Persian Gulf into a shooting gallery for commercial shipping. Over 8 brutal years, 411 ships were attacked, 239 of them petroleum tankers, and the world got its first taste of what energy warfare looked like. Iran deployed Chinese-made Silkworm cruise missiles, naval mines, and swarms of Revolutionary Guard speedboats armed with rocket launchers and heavy machine guns against unarmed merchant vessels. Insurance rates for Gulf shipping skyrocketed, maritime traffic slowed to a crawl, and the global oil market trembled at the prospect of a full closure of the world's most vital waterway. But even then, in the middle of a desperate 8-year war for national survival, Iran never actually followed through on its threat to close the Strait of Hormuz completely. Instead, the United States stepped in with Operation Earnest Will, the largest naval convoy operation since the Second World War, escorting reflagged Kuwaiti tankers through the danger zone. More than 30 American warships flooded the Gulf, joined by Air Force surveillance planes and Army Special Operations helicopters hunting for Iranian attackers in the darkness. When Iran planted mines that nearly sank the frigate USS Samuel B. Roberts in April 1988, the United States responded with devastating force in Operation Praying Mantis. In a single day, the U.S. Navy destroyed 2 Iranian oil platforms, sank an Iranian frigate, crippled another, and sent multiple gunboats to the bottom of the Gulf. It was the largest American naval surface engagement since World War II, and it taught the Iranian military a lesson they would remember for the next 4 decades. The lesson was unmistakable. When push came to shove, the United States Navy had the power to keep the Strait of Hormuz open by force, no matter what Iran threatened. Fast forward to 2026. and the Iranian regime found itself facing the ultimate nightmare scenario: a full-scale American and Israeli military assault with no diplomatic off-ramp in sight. In the weeks before the strike, Iranian commanders conducted exercise Smart Control of the Strait of Hormuz on February 17th, rehearsing the very blockade they had promised for decades. They tripled their oil exports between February 15th and 20th, draining storage tanks in anticipation of a conflict that intelligence agencies on both sides knew was coming. War insurance premiums for ships transiting the strait had already doubled, climbing from 0.125% to as high as 0.4% of each vessel's value per transit. For very large oil tankers, that increase alone meant an extra $250,000 just to sail through a waterway they had crossed freely for decades. Then, in the pre-dawn darkness of February 28th, the skies over Tehran erupted with the thunder of American and Israeli precision munitions, and Operation Epic Fury began. The Pentagon made one objective crystal clear from the very first wave of strikes: the total destruction of Iran's ability to threaten shipping in the Strait of Hormuz. American Tomahawk cruise missiles, launched from Arleigh Burke-class destroyers in the Arabian Sea, slammed into Iran's most critical naval installation at Bandar Abbas within the opening hours. Bandar Abbas was not just any port, it was the headquarters of the Iranian Navy and the operational nerve center from which any Hormuz blockade would be coordinated and sustained. Satellite imagery captured after the strikes showed catastrophic fires across the base, with multiple warships ablaze at their piers and command infrastructure reduced to smoking concrete. The Iris Jamaran, a Mouj-class frigate and one of Iran's most capable surface combatants, was struck while docked at Chabahar and sank without ever firing a weapon in this war. At the Konarak naval base in southern Iran, 3 frigates and multiple corvettes were confirmed destroyed, their hulls resting on the seabed before most of the world had finished breakfast. By the end of the first day, President Trump announced that 9 Iranian naval ships had been destroyed and sunk, with Iran's naval headquarters largely demolished in the assault. The annihilation was far from over. Within 72 hours, CENTCOM confirmed that over 20 Iranian warships had been struck, and the number kept climbing with each passing hour. By March 5th, CENTCOM Commander Admiral Brad Cooper revealed the toll had surpassed 30 ships, including an Iranian drone carrier the size of a World War II aircraft carrier left burning at sea. Perhaps the single most dramatic engagement came when an American fast-attack submarine fired a Mark 48 torpedo at an Iranian warship sailing through the Indian Ocean. Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth confirmed it was the first American submarine torpedo kill since the Second World War, a gap of more than 80 years bridged in one devastating strike. Iran's most prized underwater asset, a Russian-built Kilo-class submarine capable of laying mines and ambushing merchant ships, was also targeted and reportedly sunk at its berth in Bandar Abbas. These diesel-electric submarines had been the nightmare scenario for Western naval planners, capable of lurking silently in the shallow waters near Hormuz and striking without warning. Their destruction eliminated a threat that generations of American admirals had trained to counter, and it happened not over months of grueling anti-submarine warfare, but in the span of hours. Even Iran's most advanced surface warships, the catamaran-hulled Shahid Soleimani-class corvettes, armed with anti-ship cruise missiles, were hunted down and set ablaze by American precision strikes. CENTCOM stated that within 48 hours, none of the 11 Iranian warships previously stationed east of the Strait of Hormuz remained operational in the area. In simple terms, the Iranian Navy and the Revolutionary Guard Corps Navy, the twin pillars of Tehran's maritime power, were being systematically erased from the surface of the ocean. Admiral Cooper summarized the campaign's progress with a devastating assessment. Ballistic missile attacks had decreased by 90% since day one, and drone attacks had dropped by 83%. Now, with its navy in ruins, let us examine what Iran actually accomplished with the Hormuz strategy it had spent half a century promising the world it would execute. Within hours of the opening strikes, the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps began broadcasting radio warnings on maritime VHF frequencies, declaring that no ship would be permitted to pass through the strait. On March 2nd, IRGC senior advisor Ebrahim Jabari made the threat explicit. The strait was closed, and anyone who tried to cross would have their vessel set on fire. Iran backed up these words with action. At least 4 commercial tankers were struck near the strait within the first 36 hours of the conflict. The oil tanker Skylight was hit by a projectile north of Kasab, Oman, killing 2 Indian crew members and injuring 3 others in the first commercial attack of the crisis. The MKD Viom became the first vessel in history struck by an Iranian unmanned surface vessel, a kamikaze drone boat that detonated against its hull, sparking a fire and killing an Indian sailor. The US-flagged Stena Imperative was struck twice while moored at the port of Bahrain, and a tugboat sent to rescue the crew of another damaged ship was reportedly hit by 2 missiles. These attacks achieved something real. Tanker traffic through the Strait of Hormuz collapsed to effectively zero, with over 150 vessels anchoring outside the strait to wait out the danger. Major shipping giants, including Maersk, CMA, CGM, and Hapag-Lloyd, suspended all transits, and marine insurance companies withdrew war risk coverage entirely for the entire region. By March 1st, ship tracking data showed no active tanker transits in the primary Hormuz shipping lanes, and by March 2nd, only a single small tanker was observed moving through the waterway. On paper, it looked like Iran had finally delivered on its decades-old promise. Roughly 20% of the world's daily oil supply was suddenly stranded, and crude prices surged 28%. But here is the critical truth that Iran's strategists catastrophically miscalculated. They achieved this shutdown not through overwhelming naval power, but through cheap drone strikes and fear. As energy analyst Helima Croft from RBC Capital Markets explained, all Iran had to do was launch several drone strikes near the strait, and suddenly insurers and shipping companies decided it was too dangerous. It was, in her words, an insurance-driven shutdown, not a military blockade, not a naval victory, but a temporary disruption built on the fragile foundation of risk perception and market panic. Iran did not deploy underwater minefields across the strait, did not send waves of fast attack boats to physically block the shipping lanes, and did not establish a sustainable naval cordon. Instead, it used the cheapest weapons in its arsenal, a handful of drones and 1 kamikaze boat, to spook an insurance industry that was already nervous about war premiums. And this is precisely why the Strait of Hormuz strategy was always destined to fail as a long-term weapon, because an insurance-driven shutdown can be reversed just as quickly as it was created. The moment the United States demonstrates that it can guarantee safe passage through the strait, insurers will resume coverage, shipping companies will resume transits, and the oil will flow again. President Trump understood this immediately, ordering the U.S. Development Finance Corporation to provide political risk insurance and financial guarantees for all maritime trade through the Gulf. He declared that if necessary, the United States Navy would begin escorting tankers through the Strait of Hormuz, echoing the exact same playbook that crushed Iran's tanker war strategy in 1987. Energy Secretary Chris Wright reinforced the message, stating that American escort operations would begin as soon as it was reasonable, and that energy would flow through the strait again. The comparison to Operation Earnest Will was deliberate, because the United States had already proven once before that it could keep Hormuz open against Iranian resistance, and everyone in Tehran knew it. This time, the American position was far stronger than it had been in 1987, because Iran's conventional naval capability had been virtually annihilated in the opening days of the war. In the tanker war, the U.S. Navy had to contend with an Iranian fleet that still possessed frigates, patrol boats, mines, and coastal missile batteries capable of striking escort formations. In 2026, after Operation Epic Fury, the Iranian Navy was a collection of burning hulks, sunken submarines, and shattered port infrastructure incapable of coordinated resistance. With over 30 warships destroyed, its Kilo-class submarine eliminated, and its naval headquarters in ruins, Iran lacked the physical tools to sustain any meaningful blockade. The IRGC still possessed some fast attack craft and could launch occasional drone strikes, but these harassing tactics could not hold the strait closed against a determined American naval escort force. Two carrier strike groups, the USS Abraham Lincoln and the USS Gerald R. Ford, were already operating in the region, providing 24-hour combat air patrols with F/A-18S and F-35S. 3 littoral combat ships with mine countermeasure packages were forward deployed to the Gulf, specifically designed to sweep the shallow waters of Hormuz for exactly this type of threat. Arleigh Burke-class destroyers armed with Tomahawk missiles and advanced radar systems stood ready to neutralize any Iranian missile site, drone launcher, or fast boat that entered the kill zone. Any Iranian surface vessel, missile battery, or drone detected near the shipping lanes would face immediate destruction from air or sea-launched weapons, a capability already proven in the first 48 hours. Meanwhile, Iran's so-called blockade was hurting its own neighbors and allies far more than it was hurting the United States, and this was perhaps the strategy's most fatal flaw. Iraq, Kuwait, Qatar, Bahrain, and the United Arab Emirates all depend on the Strait of Hormuz to export their oil and gas, countries that Iran desperately needed as diplomatic partners, not enemies. Iraq had already been forced to cut production by 1.5 million barrels per day because its storage facilities were filling up with oil that had nowhere to go. Qatar, the world's second-largest LNG exporter, had to halt gas production entirely on March 2nd and declare force majeure on its contracts, devastating its own economy in the process. Qatari Energy Minister Saad al-Kaabi warned that if the disruption continued, other Gulf producers would be forced to shut down exports entirely, threatening to collapse economies around the world. The bitter irony was devastating for Tehran. By trying to punish America and Israel, Iran was systematically destroying the economic foundations of every country in its own neighborhood. Saudi Arabia, showing characteristic strategic flexibility, immediately began rerouting crude through its east-west pipeline to the port of Yanbu on the Red Sea, bypassing Hormuz entirely. This pipeline, operated by Saudi Aramco, has a capacity of 5 million barrels per day and can be temporarily expanded to 7 million by converting parallel natural gas liquids lines. The UAE activated its Habshan-Fujairah pipeline, capable of moving nearly 1.8 million barrels per day from Abu Dhabi's oil fields to the Gulf of Oman without touching the strait. Combined, these alternative routes could divert roughly 3.5 to 5.5 million barrels per day away from the Strait of Hormuz, according to the International Energy Agency. That is far less than the 20 million barrels that normally transit the waterway, but it is enough to prevent a total energy catastrophe while the American military clears the strait. And the United States itself was in a remarkably strong position to weather the disruption, importing only about 500,000 barrels per day from Persian Gulf countries through Hormuz in 2024. That figure represented just 7% of total American crude imports and a mere 2% of U.S. petroleum consumption, the lowest dependence on Gulf oil in nearly 40 years. American domestic oil production had surged to record levels, and imports from Canada had expanded dramatically, meaning the economic pain of a Hormuz closure fell primarily on Asia, not the United States. IEA chief Fatih Birol sought to calm global markets, stating that there was plenty of oil available worldwide and that the situation, while serious, did not constitute an existential supply crisis. The fundamental problem with Iran's Hormuz strategy was always mathematical. Closing the strait hurt Iran and its neighbors far more than it hurt the country Iran was actually trying to punish. Iran exports the vast majority of its own crude oil through the Strait of Hormuz, meaning any sustained blockade would strangle Tehran's last remaining source of foreign revenue. Iran's own bypass pipeline, the Gorajask route to the Gulf of Oman, has a capacity of only 300,000 barrels per day and was barely functional even before the war started. So while Iran was theatrically declaring the strait closed and setting tankers ablaze with drone strikes, it was simultaneously cutting off its own economic oxygen supply in a war it was already losing. The historical pattern is undeniable. Every time Iran has threatened to close the Strait of Hormuz, the United States has responded with overwhelming force and kept the waterway open. In 1988, Operation Praying Mantis destroyed half of Iran's operational navy in a single afternoon and convinced Tehran to accept a ceasefire in the Iran-Iraq war. In 2012, when Iran again threatened closure over nuclear sanctions, 3 American carrier strike groups and a multinational flotilla transited the strait without a single Iranian shot being fired. And in 2026, Operation Epic Fury did not just reopen the strait, it eliminated the naval force structure that Iran had spent decades building precisely for this scenario. The regime spent billions on Mauj-class frigates, Kilo-class submarines, Shahid Soleimani corvettes, drone carriers, and thousands of fast attack craft, and all of it proved worthless against American precision. Iran's entire maritime strategy was built on the assumption that the cost of forcing Hormuz open would be too high for Washington to accept, that America would blink before pulling the trigger. Instead, the United States made the destruction of Iran's navy a stated war objective from hour one, treating Hormuz not as an obstacle to avoid, but as a problem to solve permanently. The insurance-driven shutdown was real, the economic pain was genuine, and the temporary disruption to global oil markets was significant. No honest analyst would deny that. But a temporary market panic caused by a handful of drone strikes is not the same as a sustainable military blockade, and Iran never possessed the capability to maintain one against American opposition. As Kepler energy analyst Matt Wright noted, ship owners will need to see a sustained period without attacks to venture through the strait again, and that period was being created by American military force. The clock was ticking not against the United States, but against Iran, because every day that passed brought more of Tehran's naval assets to the bottom of the ocean and fewer tools to sustain the disruption. History will record that Iran's Strait of Hormuz strategy was the ultimate bluff, a threat repeated so many times over so many decades that it became a pillar of Iranian strategic identity. But when the moment of truth finally arrived, the bluff collapsed under the weight of American naval supremacy, precision strike capabilities, and the simple mathematics of a strategy that punished the wrong people. The strait will reopen, the oil will flow again, and the world will remember that when the most powerful navy in human history decides a waterway stays open, it stays open. Because in the end, the Strait of Hormuz was never really Iran's weapon. It was always America's to keep, and the United States just proved it one more time.